This is episode 14 of the Lifestyle Entrepreneur Podcast. And my next guest is Srini Rao. He's the host of the Blogcast FM popular podcast. And he's going to talk about how to build a thriving tribe and a community for your business using blogging, podcasting, and Amazon publishing. Welcome to the Lifestyle Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Kris Gilbertson, and I'm an author, speaker, and a coach to teaching you how to launch your own successful podcast. And the reason I designed this show is to bring you the top lifestyle entrepreneur experts from all over the world for them to share their key strategies that they've used to launch their own businesses and allow them to live life on their own terms. So tune in every Friday for new episodes and come on over and join the Lifestyle Entrepreneur community at www.lifestyleacademy.com. There you're going to receive VIP training from specific guests from the podcast, along with being able to watch all of the interviews. And I'll also be making it really easy for you to implement these strategies that you're hearing by sending you what I like to call the Lifestyle Cliff Notes on the best of the best lessons learned on the podcast. So let's get started. All right, so before we get started with the show, I just want to thank everyone who is subscribing and leaving awesome reviews in iTunes. I'm so excited that people are enjoying these interviews. And I'm excited to announce First Fridays. So what I'm going to be doing the first Friday of every month, we're going to have a raffle for those of you that have subscribed to the podcast and then also left a review. And it'll be a raffle for $25 gift cards from iTunes, Amazon, eBay, all over the place. So all you simply need to do is just subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and then leave us a review and your name will go in a hat and we'll announce that the first Friday of every month. All right, and I'm so excited to kick off the First Friday's raffle. And so literally I'm just taking a name out of the hat from everybody that's left an awesome review for the podcast in iTunes. And the winner for this Friday, First Friday raffle, is from Blah Blah 16. So it's BLA16, and it says interesting interviews and great advice. Kris Gilbertson continues to help fellow entrepreneurs on their way to success. The interviews and guests are so helpful and motivational. Anyone looking to drive their business forward should definitely subscribe. So thanks for that awesome review. And I'm so excited for you because you've just won a $25 gift card to Amazon. So just email us over at Kris@KrisGilbertson.com. That's Kris with a K. And then we'll get you set up with your details for your Amazon gift card. And everybody else, just in order to win in the First Friday's raffle, just simply leave a 5-star review for the podcast and leave a review. Throw them into a hat and you're in it till you win. So until next time, which will be in a month for next First Fridays, let's get into the next episode. Today, my guest, I am so excited to have on the show. We are going to have an absolute blast and a riot. You're going to take a ton of content away from this. And I'm so excited about him because he's the founder and host of the Blogcast FM podcast and blog. It is one of the hottest blogs in the iTunes podcast in the iTunes marketplace. And Srini, he is phenomenal at interviewing. And that's why I'm so excited about our show today, because so many of you are starting to create your own web-based shows. And you always ask questions about how to interview, how to get connections, and how to grow your audience through your own personality and brand. And we're going to get into that. But I just want to share with you, if you're not familiar with the Blogcast FM podcast yet, he's interviewed Danielle Laporte. She's the author of the Firestarter Sessions. Michael, the best-selling author, Book Yourself Solid. Mike Stelzner, the founder, CEO of Social Media Examiner. There's so many other top experts that they've interviewed. And I just want to share just a sneak peek of some of the results that they've had just in a short while of producing their show. They literally have over 500,000 downloads on a monthly basis and rapidly growing. They get anywhere from 25,000 to 175,000 downloads per episode. And they're in the top episodes in iTunes for all their interviews. And 95% of their listeners listen to the entire show, which is just record breaking. That's phenomenal. Srini's also the author of the Small Army Strategy that he just launched on Amazon. So make sure to go head over there. And then he also has his own coaching business as well at the Skool of Life that we're going to get into and talk all about. So without further ado, I want to get started and bring Srini on the line. So welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Kris. It's kind of fun to be on the other side of the mic. You know, it's not something I get to do very often, although it's happening a lot more lately for some reason.
Good.
yeah, I'm excited to chat with you.
Well, you have so much incredible information, and you are such a phenomenal interviewer. I want to get the Srini side of the story, the other side. So let's get into it. Let's like we both start our interviews. I want to hear your background, how you got started as an entrepreneur, your story, and then we're going to kind of go into some awesome content later too.
Yeah. So I like many people, I kind of ended up here. I guess you could say serendipitously. There's a lot of things that didn't go as planned in my life. I spent 10 years in corporate America, but unlike the typical sort of solo entrepreneur that you find that has this thriving career in corporate America, I was really just a corporate misfit in every way imaginable. And, it's funny, I think about something that one of our recent guests told me. He said, he was professionally unemployable by corporate America. And I thought, yeah, that about describes me. I was never one of these people that ended up getting promoted multiple times. I was never like the six-figure earner. I was somebody who truly just was always average and mediocre at being in corporate America. I worked in sales at a couple of market research companies, but I was always tied to technology. And I realized I didn't want to be in sales for the rest of my life, so I decided to push the reset button on my career, and I went back to business school, which funny enough, now I would never recommend that to anybody, but this was 2007. Things hadn't really taken off. I mean, it's amazing how much things have changed in the last 3 to 4 years.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And it's funny because people would ask me during business school, what do you plan to do with your career? I said, as long as it has nothing to do with the internet, that is going to be my career, because I am completely done with all this internet nonsense. Because I'd spent 10 years in Silicon Valley. I wanted nothing to do with technology. So that's ironic as that seems, considering what I do now. But I went back to business school, and the summer between my first and second year of business school, I didn't get the internship I wanted, which was working on a casino floor at Harrah's, basically in casino operations. So I ended up working at Intuit as their social media intern in the TurboTax group. And during that time, I started just dabbling with content. And I didn't get a job offer at the end of my time at Intuit. And then the second year of business school happened. I mean, I was always sort of dabbling with blogging and content creation.
Yeah.
And when I got out of school, I was watching kind of what was happening in the economy. I was watching people use blogs to get hired, to get all these interesting opportunities. I mean, the stories started coming through the mainstream media. And so I started this really silly site called 100 Reasons You Should Hire Me, which was an epic failure. It was really nothing more than the bullet points on my resume in blog form. But I got attention with it, and I realized if I could actually learn to do it properly, maybe there might be something here. So that ended up resulting in the Skool of Life, which is my personal blog. And as a part of that, I started this weekly series called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Bloggers. And really, so what is now Blogcast FM literally started as nothing more than a weekly blog post on my blog. And after about 13 interviews, one of the guys that I interviewed came back to me and said, I think that you should take this off of the Skool of Life and spin it out as a separate site, because it will be a lot more successful then. In the midst of this, I did end up getting a day job. And part of the reason I started these online projects was not to actually make them my career, but because I wanted them to lead to a day job working in social media. And I worked at this online travel company, did that for about a year and a half, and ended up getting laid off from there. And before the layoff, my hours got reduced to 10 hours a week. So I lived in Costa Rica for 6 months, where I surfed every day. One of the readers of my blog and a woman who listens to my show actually ended up setting me up with rent-free housing for the entire 6 months I was there.
Awesome.
And so, my brand started becoming this sort of, relationship marketing guy, because, I was having all these things not necessarily monetarily happen, but a lot of amazing things were happening because of the connections I was making online. And so bit by bit, eventually I just started doing more freelance work. Blogcast FM started becoming really the core of what I do. I came back from Costa Rica. That was probably a year and a half ago. And really, I've been just hammering at all of this stuff ever since. And I realized going back to a normal job is I think that ship sailed a long time ago. And it's funny, like, we say professionally unemployable. And I think many of us are becoming professionally unemployable. But I don't see that as a bad thing. It's a blessing and a curse to some degree. But at the same time, I interviewed this guy, Patrick Vlaskovitz, recently, who wrote the book called The Lean Entrepreneur. And he told me something that really kind of struck a chord with me, that somebody had told him in graduate school. He said, Patrick, you're going to have to create demand for yourself in order to make money. And I realized that's exactly what my life is because I spent so much of it forcing square pegs into round holes, trying to do things that I wasn't good at, which is really easy to do because that's what you're taught to do from a very young age. Conformity is something you've been rewarded for up until several years. And until about 2 years ago, it was, take this path and it will lead to where you think it's going to lead. Well, for me, it all fell apart in a matter of months. I got out of business school, and it was like watching everything I'd built my whole life just come crumbling down like a house of cards. So I realized at that time it might be time to start questioning this whole conventional wisdom thing. So I'll turn it back over to you because I could yap on endlessly.
No, I just love hearing your story because we don't get to hear that often, the background of what happens. And I think, as entrepreneurs, and even if you're just becoming an entrepreneur, the road has been crazy to get there, but it all is like a divine purpose that unfolded, even though it seemed all crazy before. So I love hearing that because, and it's interesting too, the people that have opened the doors up for you to, like the woman that was reading the blog then said, hey, you should take this into the interview space, like actually connecting with people. So I love that. I think it's amazing. So what I'd love for you to share is really, when you got started with your show, kind of what was the focus and how did you get started with that? Because that's a lot of people want to do that, but they have questions about it and they're not sure how to do it. And you just took off and it exploded for you.
Well, it's funny. It probably seems like that now. And so what's interesting, so I started the idea was to interview other bloggers, but what I realized was that I wasn't really known in the space of, nobody knew who I was. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to interview up and coming bloggers. I was in this program called Blog Mastermind created by this guy named Yaro Starik. Blog Mastermind, I think, is no longer available, but Yaro is still around and he's still quite successful. And so I just went in the forum and said, hey, I'm on lesson 17. Here's a lesson for people who are listening. If you're enrolled in any course, whatever it is, Kris, even if somebody's enrolled in your iTunes course, one of the things that I've seen people do is they buy courses and then they don't do any of the things in the course because it's really easy to spend $300 on something and put it aside. Yep. Well, I was in a position where I'd borrowed the money from my dad. And I said, look, it's going to cost $97 a month. So I knew he would be really pissed off if I didn't follow through on everything. That was my motivator to prove that, you know what, I am serious about this. But one of the lessons was to interview people. So I made sure that I was diligent about doing all the lessons. So what I did was I went in the online forum there and I said, hey, I'm on lesson 17 and this lesson is interviewing people. But what I knew was that interviewing up-and-coming bloggers was going to be the key because I was an up-and-coming blogger. So connecting with people at my same level would be easy as opposed to, hey, who is this random guy that nobody's ever heard of? I'm not going to reach out to Seth Godin. And we can talk about why I waited 300 interviews to interview Seth Godin too. That's actually something that I thought was really useful. Okay. But I realized that people at your same level are often underestimated as we're obsessed with authority and influence in the online world. We have this sort of hero worshiping mindset. Yep. And the problem with that is that there are a lot of people at your same level or who are, sort of your peers who can be this honestly, my closest friends and the people that have really brought me to where I'm at are not the celebrity guests that I've interviewed, but the people who I have known as friends and who I started this journey with. And a lot of them were up and coming bloggers. So I started with this sort of core group of people and I would ask for referrals. And, it took 13 interviews before we even thought, okay, maybe there's more here than just doing a weekly blog post. That was kind of the idea for Blogcast FM. And it wasn't, I can't take credit even for coming up with the concept. One of the guys I interviewed, who was my first business partner, a guy named Sid Savara, he said, he didn't even want to be my business partner. He just thought it was a good idea. So I replied back and said, hey, that sounds great. When do you want to get started? And so he ended up coming along for the ride. And I mean, lucky for me, he had a lot of connections to influential people because he had already been blogging for quite some time. But he was probably my 13th interview. And so it kind of went from there. And that's why I always, one of my favorite sayings is emerging talent is the most undervalued asset on the entire blogosphere.
I love that. I mean, I love that. And I'm so glad that you said that because I think people, and I've been guilty of it too, where we just get a reverse mindset of who we need to be connecting with. And what's great is the people that are just up and coming and some of the interviews that I've had, their content and their knowledge is so amazing and people gravitate towards that because they feel that they can actually accomplish things by listening to what they're doing. It's really interesting because they're so new and maybe people don't know about them. And I love that, there's a lot of things that you just talked about that are so important, but as for entrepreneurs, we want to have people that we surround ourselves with that understand what we're going through and what we're doing. And what you talked about, just your friends, it doesn't have to be like this crazy, huge, big advisory board. A lot of people think they need to have big names with that. And I love that. And the other thing that I want you to talk about is taking action. I mean, you just stepped in and it sounds like everything that you get an idea on, do you implement pretty quickly? I mean, as soon as you have the idea, are you off of the ground running or what's your process for that?
So So, it's funny you're talking about this because we just had a strategy call with our business coach the other day, and she made us table every idea we had. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I want to strangle you because, I'm not the most patient person in the world. Luckily, my business partner, David, is much smarter about this because I am very impulsive. Like if I have an idea, here's the thing. It's a blessing and a curse. If I have an idea, I want it launched by the end of this week and I want the $1 million check in my bank account on Monday. And that doesn't work. That honestly, again, it's a blessing and a curse. Yep. Now, smaller ideas, there's a great book that I refer to a lot called Little Bets by a guy named Peter Sims. He's a venture capitalist. He talks about the innovation process that people like Pixar, people like Chris Rock, people like Steve Jobs all use. And the idea is to take small actions that won't break you or bankrupt you, but to be able to test concepts. Even the last book I did really was nothing more than an experiment. And one thing I think about is conducting experiments that are sort of low maintenance, right? Things that won't necessarily bankrupt you or really hurt you. What Peter Sims essentially calls little bets. You look at it and you say, okay, I could do this thing. It's not going to require an insane amount of effort. It may generate a result, but even if it doesn't work, it's not going to be the end of the world. And the problem I've seen in the online world is a lot of people will have ideas and they don't act on them because they think they have to be perfect. And let me tell you, I've seen books from best-selling authors go to print that have typos in them. I know because my name is misspelled in one.
Oh, no. But, to that point, though, it's so true. I mean, you have to – it's like building the ship as you fly it. And I think – I learned that the hard way, too, is making it perfection. Harv Eker, I'm a big follower of him, and he always says, perfect mediocrity or sloppy success is better than perfect mediocrity any day. And it's so true. You just have to take the steps. So when you go through a process, because I'm just like you, where it's like I've got all these ideas. I want to run 110 miles an hour in all these directions. But as entrepreneurs, our biggest saboteur is distraction. For all of us. So what is your process and how have you created a process that I know you have your business partner to help you with that, but for you yourself, because a lot of entrepreneurs, we have an addiction problem, we have, because we're going all over the place. How do you kind of work through that with your ideas and know which ones to work on and do the small steps for and move forward with?
I think about one where they could lead. Like, there's certain ideas that are overly ambitious. I think that's obviously to some degree we all have that as entrepreneurs. I think that we all are extremely ambitious. We always look at everything being bigger than it could possibly be. And so I kind of look at that and say, okay, you know what, maybe, but in a lot of ways I think you kind of do what the minimum viable thing is to get you feedback and to figure out whether it's worth doing. And I used this process that I used on my last book. It was actually very much an experiment, but a very eye-opening one in terms of developing content. Because I was sharing huge chunks. You and I are friends on Facebook. I was putting out probably 3-4 paragraphs status updates, all of which
awesome. Yeah,
made their way into the book. But I didn't know that I wanted to write. I had the idea for the book, but I just started throwing them out just to see how people would respond. And I noticed that I was striking a chord in a way that I never had before. So I knew that I had to be onto something here, but it was a really nice way to sort of test whether I keep going or not. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've seen, and I'm guilty of it as anybody, is people will spend weeks on end building something and then find out that nobody wants it, and that sucks. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting with this book that I was so public. I more or less gave it away bit by bit. Nobody had to buy it, and yet they did it. In fact, I just found out it's number 3 in the advertising category in Amazon this morning.
Congrats!
So, thanks. But so I look at one, how am I going to learn from it, even if it doesn't work out? Like that's very important, because the thing is, if you do something that's completely useless and you spend a ton of time on it and you don't learn anything from it, well, then you've just wasted time. So I thought about this, what am I going to learn from this? At least I'll learn some lessons in book marketing. I'll learn some lessons in packaging a self-published book. Even though I'd done 2 before, I thought I'll also learn lessons in repurposing content. So I think about, what am I going to learn? to what am I going to lose if this thing fails, which is probably nothing. Seth Godin told me something when I asked him about how he takes projects from inception to launch, and he says, something he likes to say to himself is, this might not work. And the thing is that you have no attachment to it, because
Right.
I think one of the things that we all do is we attach our sense of self to whatever the outcome is. Like, people say, and it's easier said than done. I mean, I can sit here and I can tell you this, and I can tell you this as somebody who's having a book that is having some success. But I can honestly tell you, if the book flopped, I would probably feel pretty bad about it. But that being said, it is sort of, this idea that the results that you generate from your efforts don't define you as a person. And I've always – it's something that I'm trying to get my head around more and more, because I feel like once you can kind of really live that, you can start to do really interesting work.
That's brilliant. And I think that is one of the biggest lessons just as entrepreneurs in general, is enjoying the journey and the process that we go through, the failures, the ups and downs. It's funny because I like to watch Shark Tank a lot, and they'll have those entrepreneurs that are just have fallen in love with their product for years and years and years, and they won't change anything. They won't adjust with it. They won't adjust with the market, what has changed. And that's so crucial as an entrepreneur going forward, especially like our technology, everything changes every 2 years. So we have to keep evolving and be flexible. And I love that you talk about that with the small steps. Take risks, but not risky risks where it's putting too much out there and you could lose the whole farm with just one idea.
Okay, so here's something that I wrote about recently, and I can't remember, it was one of our newsletters, and I talked about this idea of we overestimate the consequences of our risks, and the two worst possible things that could happen to you is either you die or you go to jail. Okay?
Yeah.
And most of the online projects that people are holding back on, none of the things that, even if they fail epically, they're not going to experience those two consequences.
I love this. As you see, I'm taking a ton of notes right now, but I love that idea. It's brilliant. And no one's ever said it that way, because when you think about it, it really is. Like because I get overworked. I'm like, oh my gosh, what about this? What about this? And we get stressed out. We make ourselves stressed out with the products we're working on. And really, you have to put it in perspective. What's the worst that's going to happen? I love that with Seth Godin too. If it fails, okay, so what do you learn from it? And then how do you move on? So let's talk about your book. And I love the content that you talked about, how you pieced it out on Facebook to get the interaction. And I just love that strategy. I loved when you were doing that, because it gave everybody, it was great, because I thought you were just doing it for foreshadowing of this is, it's the launch of the book. So tell me about that, and then what's in the book and how that all got together.
Well, the Facebook stuff, I honestly that was not intentional. Like, I really didn't sit down one day and say, you know what, I'm going to piece by piece give out concepts from this book on Facebook. So I had I had the idea for a book. Mark Schaefer, who I write for at his blog Grow, had mentioned that I had been riffing on a theme the entire year of 2012. And I thought, wait a minute, if I'm riffing on a theme, I wonder if I could take all the posts and package them into a book and see what happens. Because I looked at this pattern. I realized that if you look at even some of our very well-known authors and our sort of heroes, even Seth Godin does this, even though he told me that he doesn't plan it this way when I interviewed him. I asked him about it. He said, Srini, you're imagining things. But if you look in his books, you'll actually see he does use a lot of content that he has written on his blog.
Yeah.
And I realized, it was a lesson in the fact that as a body of work, the impact is very different than an individual blog post. And that's a whole other conversation, which we can talk about in a second. But what I realized is I had all this content on Mark's blog, and I wanted to put something out there that was very representative of my sort of view, my worldview, that says, this is how I view the online world. This is what really is important to me. But I also realized, as the 12 or 13 blog posts that made up the book, it wasn't going to be enough. It needed coherence to it. It needed an arc and narrative. And I just started really thinking about a lot of concepts that I had heard over the last few years, and a lot of things that I started to notice with my own listeners, and a lot of different things. And so I started literally just throwing things on Facebook that were on my mind, because I would have these morning writing sessions and I would put stuff out there. And honestly, I didn't put them out there with the intention of putting them into the book. I wasn't using that stuff to put them in the book, but then I started to realize, I was like, wait a minute, this all kind of flows together. Mm-hmm. And so the book came together in this really sort of organic way that I didn't necessarily plan. I mean, I came up with the title, The Small Army Strategy. I knew that that was what I wanted to be called. I knew that I was going to have the blog post that I'd written for Mark Schaefer's blog as part of it. But all those other parts, the parts that were on Facebook, really made their way in there organically. And amazingly enough, as I started seeing the feedback, as I said, I started to notice I was really striking a chord with people. Something about this was really different than anything that I had written to date. Like, I've been writing for probably 3 or 4 years now, but nothing has had that same effect with people. And so then I knew this needs to get into the book, because if this is what it's happening on Facebook, what's going to happen when people really read it?
Yeah, I love the process that comes through, and I highly suggest everybody write a book because of the process that you go through and what you discover from yourself. But what was really interesting, I mean, there's a lot that you covered there, but what stands out right away is you knew your title. And see, a lot of people are the opposite. They have the content, but they don't have the title. So I like your strategy of putting that together, because did you already have a plan of wanting to write a book, or was it mainly kind of just that nudge of the theme and the places you were going already?
Okay, so one thing I didn't mention, which I should have mentioned when we talked about goals and actions, is I use this program called Pick4, which is Seth Godin's adaptation of Zig Ziglar's goal-setting program. Hands down, the most effective goal-setting guide in the world, because what it does is it makes you sit down at the beginning of 12 weeks and write down these 4 goals. And every day you take action and you write down, what did you do today towards this goal? And it's amazing because it's really simple, but it works. And you know when you're not accomplishing something, because every day you say, you know what, I've done nothing towards this goal. Like, I have one of those on my 12-week list, and I realized, wow, I've done nothing towards this in like the last week, and I'm dangerously close to not accomplishing this goal in this next 12 weeks. So, that being said, things kind of changed. I mean, I had the idea for the Small Army Strategy, but I've already had 2 self-published books, and I wanted to do this one for a couple of reasons. One is that I wanted a level of authority associated with what I do, and say, okay, this is what I stand for. And in some ways, I think this was a sequel to the first ebook I wrote called Relationship Marketing for Bloggers, but written in a much more eloquent way, and written, with my worldview after 300 interviews and 3 years on the web. So I think that's why it really struck a chord with people in a different way than it did before. So did I sit down and plan it right from the get-go? Not necessarily. I mean, I had the idea. It came to fruition a lot faster than I thought it would. One, because strangely enough, I mean, the concepts in the book are what made it happen, because, I have a small army that actually helped. I had David Crandall, my business partner, design a book cover. Somebody else who was following me on Facebook ended up editing the book for free because she happened to be a former book editor. Oh, awesome. I mean, bit by bit, like, all these people came out of the woodworks to make it happen. And and I realized, exactly, because what I had done is I'd used all the concepts in this book over the course of the last 3 years. I had built a small army, and amazingly enough, they all came to help me to make it happen.
I love that. And what I really like the best about it too is that, I mean, I'm going through and reading this and then other works. I mean, I love all your work regardless. Your book has a total different tone though. It really does. It has that philosophical, there's so much more involved with it, and it's a deeper level, and just what you talked about, your worldview, but you had to go through your other writing and to come into this. So the taking the action crafted this, it's like 3.0, Srini or whatever it is, with the process.
Yeah.
But
I'll tell you something, that 80% of everything I write is complete garbage. Hey,
I think
seriously.
That's everybody. Well, maybe not for, great.
The thing
writers.
is, I don't publish 80% of what I write either. I mean, the amount of stuff that I have to go through to get to something decent, I don't, I'm not as disciplined as somebody like a Julian Smith who does 1,000 words of free writing every day, but I noticed a pattern. When he mentioned that to me, he said, yeah, in doing that, maybe 100 words of it will be really brilliant, and then you build from that 100 words. And I noticed that pattern actually really works, because I'll sit down and I'll hammer at the keyboard and nothing. There's this. I was having this conversation with Ryan Hanley the other day. There's a great movie called With Honors. I don't know if you've ever seen it, with Joe Pesci and this guy who is writing a senior thesis at Harvard. Brendan Fraser, I think, is the guy's name.
Oh, okay.
So anyways, Joe Pesci reads his senior thesis. He's like, yeah, man, this stuff is really coming out the wrong end. And that's how I feel about my writing most of the time, you know? And that's honestly, like, most of it is really bad, but you have to go through that to get to the good stuff. I mean, and it's, again, you know, it's all a constant evolution. It's not something that is static, right? Like, now, here's the curse of the fact that this book is done as well as it has. Now you're like, okay, great. How do I repeat that? And that actually, believe it or not, and it's funny because I wrote about that in the book. The same thing that makes you popular, the minute you try to replicate that, that's how you water down your work.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, just to kind of spin off on that, because a lot of people, entrepreneurs getting started, they hold themselves back because, one, perfection, and then two, the fear factor. So do you think it's the fear? I know this is totally tangential, but do you think it's fear of success, or what you talked about, the fear of being a success and then what happens after that to maintain it? Because I think it's kind of like the chicken and egg syndrome there of what people really think of what's holding them back.
You do. It's funny because I've heard so many people talk about fear of success, and I always think, I'm like, that's such bullshit. I'm like, who would fear success? That makes no sense to me at all. It's like, you know, like, maybe I'm wrong. I don't, you know, I'm not in a position to speak, but I don't fear $1 million showing up in my bank account. If that happened, I'd be like, all right, sweet, I'm out of here. I'm going to go surf the world.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, it's funny. I guess fear of losing what you've already had, that may be what it is that traps people, because it's funny. And everybody who has created anything that reaches a lot of people or has had some level of success will tell you that replicating, you get addicted to the glow. It really, honestly, that's the challenge. It's what I call the paradox of popularity. And ironically, you know, what made you so good at what you did is you weren't addicted to the glow. You weren't trying to be popular. You weren't trying to create something that people would like. I think if you try to create something that you think other people are going to like, it's a recipe for disaster. I didn't write this book for the masses. I wrote it for the people who supported me day in and day out for the last year. The book is not about me or my worldview. It's about the experiences that I've had connecting with them. Mm-hmm. And like people are like, why is the book 99 cents? It was like, because I didn't write it to make money, because let's face it, books don't make money. I've had New York Times bestselling authors tell me books don't make money. So I figured, why waste my time with a book that a lot of people won't have access to? So that was another thing. But yeah, I think that I don't necessarily know if we fear success. I think we fear losing what we've already built. So yeah, I guess you could call it a fear of success. That was a really roundabout way of explaining something.
No, it's great. I mean, because I think it's the fear of the success, and I like to hear different perspectives on it, because that's what a lot of people, it's all in their head is all it is, really. So it's once people can understand that and listen to themselves and move forward, they can start taking action and get over that. Because as soon as you start taking action, all that crap just disappears, because you don't have time. You're into what you're doing, and you're writing your book, you're doing your blog, you're doing your radio show, whatever it is, you're taking action, and it curbs the rest of that. So I think that's great. So what I'd love to talk about is, let's talk about the show again for a second, because I want to talk for people that are new to maybe meeting you yet. One of my favorite quotes about your show is that people say, "I can't believe it's free." I mean, you've got amazing testimonials, but that's my favorite one because of the content you get. I mean, literally, I've spent thousands of dollars on products to listen to a show and be like, oh my gosh, it's right here. So talk to us about how you go about interviewing, your style of interview, and then, I'll take one question at a time. Let's start with that.
Okay. I take that as the greatest compliment. Like, it is cool to see that. We do get people say, I've listened to your show, and a lot of people say one of your interviews is often better than a lot of people's paid products, and which that's really awesome to hear. I mean, and I've worked really hard to get to that point. But here's what I'll tell you. One of the things that a lot of people don't know, and this is why I like being on the other side of the mic, is I'm a horrible listener. Like, I don't listen well at all. And strangely, that's what's forced me to be a very good listener on the show. I don't script anything. Like, I don't have any questions planned ahead of time. I have an opening question and I have an ending question. The structure for what I do is actually quite simple, but strangely enough, a lot of people say, well, that's really kind of oversimplifying it. It also helps that I'm very chatty and I know how to guide a conversation, naturally. But I'll give you my sort of structural breakdown. It's stupidly simple. The reason I don't script anything is, as I mentioned, I'm a lousy listener. So if I was scripting stuff, I wouldn't be listening. I'd be thinking about the next question. Yep. Whereas what I'm forced to do is listen very closely, and I build every question based on the answers I'm given. So literally my formula is question, answer, question about the answer that I was given. And I just repeat this on a loop throughout the interview. And of course, the result is that you don't just scratch the surface on anything. That's why I will turn down anybody. I don't care how famous they are. If they say, I won't give you an hour, I'll say, well, that's great. Let me know when you're free, because we love to have you, but we do an hour interview because we don't scratch the surface. And it doesn't matter who it is. We don't make exceptions to that rule. And that's one thing, I think people get tempted to do. They'll say, oh, this is a celebrity guest. We'll do whatever you want. And I don't do that because you know what? We have a standard that we have set for our listeners, and they expect this from us. Yeah. And, sometimes I have to work with constraints, but I always make sure that I get that, like at least 50 minutes to an hour, because if I don't, then I can't do what I do. So that's really the structure for it. Obviously, I've refined the skill over time. The other thing that I keep in mind, and, a lot of this has been driven by listener feedback, because one of my listeners actually told me, he's like, you interrupt your guests. You don't listen. This was in the early days of the show. So I made sure I was very conscious of that from that point forward. And he even emailed me back 4 months later. He said, I noticed that you've really worked at refining this. And I was like, okay, cool. The other thing that I really think about is, okay, is the person listening to this getting value, right? Because again, we go back to my whole small army thing, is attention is this incredibly valuable currency, right? The fact that somebody is giving you their attention in a world where interruptions are, let's face it, there's now 200,000 shows in iTunes, if I remember correctly from your webinar, maybe more. And people are listening to other ones as well. Like, so the thing you think about is, okay, is the person that is listening to this, are they getting value out of it? Like, one woman told me she watches one TV, she watches PBS and she listens to our show. And those are the only two things that keep her attention for an extended period of time. So to me, it's kind of like, okay, what value is the person who's listening getting out of this? And the other thing is, when you think about what does value mean, to me, it's, are they going to walk away with something that they can act on? Or is there going to be something actionable? And you know what? You may not always get something actionable. Sometimes it's inspiring. One thing that I don't think enough podcasters think about, and I'm glad you kind of touched on it yesterday when you were in the webinar, is I think that there's an entertainment component to being on a podcast. And like, you can't just take the information that you're giving out via your blog and read it and think that that's going to lead to a successful podcast. It's funny because people know me by my voice. It's really weird when people tell you, by the way, you're my daily commute to work every day.
Yep, that's awesome. Yeah.
And so, part of that makes me realize, there is, like, let's forget sort of the business world of podcasting and go look at the people who are truly successful at a level that none of us are at yet. I mean, we look at sort of in our world, we say, okay, Pat Flynn and Mike Stelzner, and those are the standards. But really, if you think about it, the people who are getting just massive are the entertainers.
Yep.
Like the Mark Marons, the Adam Carollas, because they understand that, you know what? We're in an entertainment medium as well. So I think that part of what has made our show successful is that we do have an entertainment component to it. One thing that was surprising to me was when listeners said, we listen for you just as much as we listen for your guests. So that's a good chunk of it. I mean, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it.
Well, just so much right there. Literally, I love the listener, because a lot of people don't always focus on that. They want to maybe get certain information. That's why you want to know your listener base too, of who's connecting with you and what you're talking about. So let's back up for a second. So I love the breakdown of how you interview. I think it's so brilliant. And when you start your own show, just so everybody knows, literally the amount of knowledge that you learn is just phenomenal, but your presentation and how you connect with people, your communication level just goes through the roof. So if you can talk a little bit more about that, about how, because interviewing, it's an art, it really is. And the better questions you ask, and I'm trying to get better at this myself, the better answers you get. So kind of share a little bit about that and how you do that.
Okay. So the number one thing I think that really helps me is presence, right? A lot of my ideas on presence come from the fact that I'm a surfer, and there's nobody that doesn't know that. I mean, if you follow me online at all, it's very obvious that surfing kind of is the driving force of my life. And, when you surf, you have to be present, because if you're not, you're done. You're underwater. You'll be submerged. And so when I interview people, one of the things that I have had to train myself to do is because I'm super ADD. Like it's funny because people will ask me, what podcast do you listen to? And I honestly wasn't a very big podcast listener because I don't have the attention span for them. And now that I found out you can play them on 2X, every now and then I'll go in and listen to things that I want to check out. But the thing that for me has been really instrumental, and it's funny because I've noticed when I've talked to people on Skype, now I'm super hyper aware of it. Like I was talking to a friend the other day that I hadn't talked to in a while at Skype, and I was like, okay, she's not listening. This is bullshit. I'm gonna stop talking to her now.
Yeah.
And she's a good friend of mine. Like she's somebody that I could tell she wasn't listening to anything I was saying. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I do is when I'm interviewing somebody, it's like literally I might have a piece of paper and a pen at most. And the only reason I do this, I don't even take notes during my interviews because even that would be too distracting. I will share a technique that I do use during certain interviews when I'm not completely sure about how to sort of take the interview direction. Like I shut down everything. No Twitter, no Facebook, nothing. Because the thing is, no matter how much you think that, okay, yeah, I can pay attention. Like when you see your name pop up on Twitter, you see like a Facebook notification, like your immediate instinct is it's like that dopamine hit thing, right? That they talk that everyone talks about. You're like, oh, shiny thing. Let me check it out. Which is annoying. I can hear it even when I'm interviewing somebody and they're not paying attention. But I mean, these days I'm good at getting people to pay attention. Like I'm also conscious enough to filter out who I should have. That's one thing. I mean, selecting your guests is a whole other art form as well. You would think sometimes that some of my favorite guests have been people that are lesser known because they really – one, they come out and they're generous with their advice. They rock. Like people that I don't know or haven't heard of before will come and you'll be like, whoa. And it's amazing because the listeners notice it too. Yep. So it's not always about getting the biggest guests or the most famous people. Now, the technique that I was telling you about taking notes. So I interviewed Robert Greene, well-known author, guy who wrote, 48 Laws of Power, Mastery. And Robert Greene is not a typical blogger entrepreneur. So I thought, okay, this is going to be very complicated. I've got to do this in a way that makes a lot of sense. And I have to adapt according to what it is. So I came up with this idea of sort of drawing a map of the conversation, right? And so if I didn't know where I wanted to go next while he was saying what I was saying, I would basically draw whatever he was talking about. And I would say, okay, now we can go in any two directions and draw an arrow off. And that would lead to the next question. So it's what I call, drawing a map of the conversation, and that's what you can make it up. And obviously, the key is to draw the map as you're going along. Yeah. And so I have this just jumble of nonsense when I get done. But what's amazing is it actually leads to this really natural flow of conversation. That's another reason I don't script interviews is because one thing that I know when I've been interviewed, I can spot, and I can see it in other people's interviews too, is when somebody scripts something, it's very obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that how the deconstruction of your interview process of having it just be a roadmap. So for me, I like to have questions. But it's more for me on the front end when I'm doing my research, because I do a couple hours of research to know about the guests, but to kind of get everything covered with it. And then I pick, and I don't even ask most of the questions because we get the live conversation going. So I like that tip too. It keeps it real. The listeners want to have that real connection of like the fly on the wall of knowing what you're really about and not scripted, which is really powerful. So let's go into how you select your guests and then how you've been able to build such a stellar portfolio, and then your 300 interview strategy with Seth. I want to come back to that.
Sure. Okay, so I want to comment on one thing you said, about doing research, and this is probably going to come as a shock to people. I do almost no research on my guests. Maybe 5 minutes of research. I read their about page, which is at most what I'm willing to do, and I don't recommend this for everybody. I don't think this is necessarily this takes a lot of skill. I can do this now. I don't necessarily think I could have done it before. Yep. But I think that's part of the reason I get these sort of juicy conversations out of people is because I don't do this world of research. Because then it leaves me curiosity. Let's just leave it at that. Being curious is so valuable in an interview. Yep. But okay, so as far as sort of how I get guests and my guest selection strategy. Again, we come back to this whole idea that it's not even about me. It's never about me, and it's never about the guest. It's all about people listening, and I always keep that in mind. Are they going to find this interesting? Now, sort of what I look for is this person going to be useful? Are they going to be inspiring? Are they going to be entertaining? Those are sort of my three sort of barometers. And amazingly enough, sometimes the most famous people are not. I had a really, really well-known guest recently, and I was kind of taken aback by the fact that I was kind of not he wasn't what I expected him to be. So we'll leave it at that without naming any names. Now, this goes back to the whole thing that it's not necessarily always the most famous people that are going to be the most interesting guests. Like each person, there's also this whole idea of on-air chemistry. I mean, there's certain people. This is something that you really, if you learn to pay attention to it, will become a valuable asset. I mean, that's the reason I have so many amazing relationships online, is because I know when I have really clicked with a guest, like there's something special that has happened. It's much more than an interview. Like my friend Erica Learmark, who is from dailywhip.com.
Love Erica. Yeah.
Something, what I noticed with her is that unlike, there was something there. Like we were like, okay, wait a minute. This is not just an interview. This is the start of a much bigger friendship. There's a connection that's happened here. And I just had a woman named Laura Garnett on the show. Absolutely loved her. Like, she's actually our episode today. And I didn't know her, but I mean, we hit it off and I was like, okay, cool. And so I think learning to be aware of that is really critical. As far as how I go out and select, so I look for interesting stories, and I'm always kind of keeping an eye on what happens. I will ask people who I've had before. That's a basic strategy. Is if you interview somebody, ask them if they recommend anybody. And of course, if you're reading books. So here's the other thing. I also know when somebody has something coming out, it's an easy time to get them on the air. If they have a book, it's like, okay, well, you know what? I know you need to promote the book. Because I know how authors promote their books because I've interviewed 300 of them.
Yeah.
So I always know when somebody wants to promote something, they're much more likely to say yes. But what it comes down to at the end of the day is, again, it's all about the listener. Is the listener going to enjoy this? And so there's that. Of course, now very few people say no to me now, mainly because I have a lot of credibility. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you this. There's a guy. So I don't know if you've read The Startup of You, the book by the co-founders of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman and Ben Casinocha.
I've heard about it. I haven't read it yet. Yeah.
Okay. So Ben is a fairly well-known blogger. And and Ramit Sethi is a friend of his because I heard Ramit mention Ben in something, and I've had Ramit as a guest. So I emailed Ben and I said, hey, I've had Ramit as a guest. I figured he would say yes, and he turned me down. So you can't take any of this stuff personally, right? Like somebody turns you down. Sometimes people will turn you down because they don't like being interviewed, and some people are shitty at being interviewed. Like just because you have to have somebody who also knows how to articulate their story. Just because somebody has an amazing story, it doesn't mean they're good at articulating it. And Danielle Laporte has a really great post on her blog about how to give an interview. And she is a fabulous interviewee. Mm-hmm. She's one of those people that if you interview her, the way she articulates her advice, she's just brilliant. And so that's something to consider is, what is this person going to be like on the air? Are they going to be somebody that is generous with their advice? Like if somebody comes to me and they're purely in promotional mode, I'm incredibly conscious of that because yes, I want you to come and talk about your book. Fine. That's why we have you there. But at the same time, I want you to provide value to the listeners. Like I don't let anybody come on and do a straight up pitch of their book. Yeah. They have to talk about their story.
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's so true because my research, just to kind of frame that a little bit better, is really a lot more to see what other interviewers have asked people to kind of find the void for the interviewer, the listeners, because there's so many shows out there that to separate yourself a little bit, you want to find the pockets that people haven't gone into. So I like that. I love that idea too of the quality of the interview you're creating. You're always focused on your listener, which is at the end of the day, that's why we're doing this. I mean, it's for that base. So we want to make sure we're giving back to them. So how, with your listener base, how did you, because when people first get started in the interweb, your audience isn't that big and you don't really know who's out there listening, especially with podcasting, because you're all over the place, but you don't know who's tuning in. How did you craft your message and your listener base to actually know what your listeners wanted? Besides just feedback too, like what are some of the ways that you've been able to do that?
Strangely, I think my answer to this is probably going to disappoint you a little bit. I do pay attention. Probably the closest thing to market research we did is last year I got a group of 10 or so listeners that people who had emailed me over the years and said, okay, we really love the show. I said, hey, listen, we want to do a feedback group and we really want to kind of hear from you. We'll do a focus group, but we'll set it up in Google Plus, which was an ideal way to get our Google Plus presence built. So we got about 10 or 20 listeners, and every day we would ask them questions about things. And because in Google Plus you can notify them, we would get all these really in-depth answers. So we used that to shape a lot of feedback. But before that, I mean, we were never really asking for feedback. I guess, you call it the Steve Jobs approach to customer development, because I don't think people know what they want necessarily. Yep. And the other thing is that what people say they want and what they actually want, there's a huge gap. So I think there is a level of guesswork and intuition that goes into it. It's funny because I saw, Simon Cowell do this masterclass with Oprah, and he said, I just take a shot at what people like, and I think they're going to like what I like. So, I do take requests from guests. Listeners will sometimes send me a guest and say, hey, you should interview this person. Yeah. Sometimes I'll go and look at it. Other times I'll basically say, no, you know what? I'm not going to interview this person because something about them doesn't seem to strike a chord with me.
Yeah.
I trust my intuition when it comes to that. And for the most part, it's paid off. There have been exceptions, but for the most part, I trust my ability to select guests at this point.
Yeah. I think that's great. It's not like trying to deconstruct it too much, but it's really trusting your gut, and you would like attracts like. So what you're interested in is what everybody else is interested in too. So I think that's brilliant. So the one thing I was kind of thinking about with this is for sponsorships, because you have brought on sponsors, and tell us about that process and how you've been able to go about doing that. Because that's one of the hottest shows on my podcast that people always ask me about is sponsorship. So, and it's growing bigger. It's an $18 billion industry last year of funding entrepreneurs with sponsorship. So if you don't know about that, that's huge. So for the listeners, so go ahead, share with us how that worked.
It's funny. Sponsors are a blessing and a curse, right? I've had ups and downs with them. I've had a sponsor that went for 8 months. Lessons learned from sponsors. Here's one thing. One, never do a month-to-month contract with a sponsor. Lock them in for an extended period of time. These are all stupid first-time mistakes that you make. The other thing is, again, you got to think about your audience here. Integrity of the show is something that I will never compromise for the sponsors. And so that is one thing. Sponsors honestly have been very difficult for us because we've seen them come and go. It hasn't been something that has always been easy. And now I think it's starting to become more prevalent. And I have a feeling we're going to reap the benefits of the podcasting renaissance has started in the last 6 months. And we started 3.5 years ago. And I think we're going to see we're going to reap the benefits of that for sure. There's no question in my mind. But at the same time, sponsors are nerve-wracking in one way because you're kind of always at the mercy of somebody else. You don't want that to be your primary revenue stream. Right. That being said, I think really what it comes down to is what does your audience want, and can you connect the sponsor and the audience in a way that makes sense? Right. And we know our audience is bloggers, entrepreneurs, authors. So let's say dog food company wanted to sponsor us. Even if they paid us $5,000 a month, it would make absolutely no sense to have a dog food company. Yeah, maybe some of our listeners own dogs, but that would make no sense as a sponsor. Yeah. So that's what I think you really have to think about when it comes to sponsors. Again, the multi-month agreements are key. I think a solid media kit is really essential, just because if you want to get sponsors, it really is a sales job. And I know you had Linda Hollander here. I mean, she probably understands it better than most people. Yep. I've went out and had to sell it myself, and it's not an easy thing. If you think that here's the thing that I want to caution people against, because you mentioned it's an $18 billion industry, and that might have lit people's ears up. It takes a lot of work. It's a sales job. I mean, you are banging on doors. I spend, here's one of my tricks. I look at TechCrunch every single day to see what startups have been venture funded or anything like that. And I think about, okay, what will they do? And I've been rather than, and I've started to read corporate blogs, even though I think most of them suck, mainly because I know I can tell them how to improve them. And that's the angle that I will usually take to get my foot in the door as, potential sponsor and say, look, you guys could be doing this, and this in your blog. By the way, I have this show and I could become this vehicle for you. Because the thing that I've realized, you look at people like Robert Scoble. One of the things that I've asked a lot of my recent guests who conveniently have been investors and advisors in startups is, how do I play the game at that level instead of being sort of a next big blogger? Because, I mean, let's face it, Tim Ferriss told me most of his money comes from the startups he's invested in. Equity in venture funded startups.
Yep. Quite
valuable. And the thing is, a lot of us are like, I'm connected in a way that very few people are to be able to push awareness out of certain products. Like, I look at Robert Scoble as a great example of what you could become, and we've been paying a lot of attention to him. So all that being said, you have to hustle your ass off if you want sponsors. And I'm learning this the hard way. Like, it's not, hey, I started this show. Yes, it happens to some people who have a massive presence right out of the gate.
Yep.
But they don't just come knocking on your door.
That is so, and I learned that last year because I was interviewing Linda, and then Ron Seaver's another great one that helps people with sponsors, and he talks about it too. He started his whole company on a little idea that it took him a couple years to launch it, and then they finally got the sponsors involved with it and people involved. It took a while though to develop it, but it is very true, and I really, really like and appreciate that you talked about pairing up the sponsor with what your brand is. There's a top company that actually had a sponsor for 12 years. I'm not going to name the company, but they lost their sponsor of 12 years, which is a highly funded Fortune 100 company. And because their branding and their messaging and their marketing wasn't consistent anymore with the sponsor. And so that is really powerful. And it's a benefit for the listener as well, because you want to have them connect for the right reason. So that's brilliant. That's amazing.
One other thing I will say is this is something that I think we didn't think about nearly enough, is you want the sponsor to be invested in your success as well. That is so critical. Like, if the sponsor just if the sponsor sees you as just a place to advertise, then you're in trouble.
Yeah. And to the other side of that, a sponsor is not your sugar daddy. I mean, it's not it's a partnership. It's a real partnership. Yeah, so that is brilliant. And you really do. You want that growth because they can help you get to the next level for your business, but you're also, it's a give and take and working together. So that's amazing. So what I want to talk about is, well, I've got a ton more questions for you, but tell me more about your business that you've started on the side. Well, I shouldn't say on the side, but it's, your predominant is the Blogcast FM, but now you've got the Skool of Life. And tell us about that and how you work with people and how that all evolved.
It's strange. I don't do a ton of personal development coaching. It's not what I want to do. I never wanted to be a life coach. I honestly, the Skool of Life, what I thought would be a business really is more a hobby, and it's a testing ground. Like, I treat it now as a laboratory for ideas that come on Blogcast FM. It's a great place to come up with content and say, okay, you know what? Let me see what sticks. I wrote this thing called the Extraordinary Achievers Manifesto because I wanted to test ideas. So what that blog has done is given me a platform to sort of concept ideas, to test ideas. And of course, I have a lot of thoughts of my own that I want to share with the world. And so really, that's the bulk of what it does. I mean, here's the other thing it does, is it gives me a piece of my portfolio that I can point to and say, this is part of my work. Mm-hmm. It's another one of those credibility builder things. It's like, hey, I've built this blog. I've grown this thing. I designed it. So it's really in a lot of ways just a showcase of many of my skills. And, it's definitely led to a lot of things. But really, the bulk of my effort these days is really funny. I was telling one of my friends the other day, I was like, you think I should sell the Skool of Life? He said, your readers would hate you if you did that. And it's true, they would. Yeah. And I realized it wouldn't be worth selling, because it is something that is special to me. But I also realized I don't really see it as a business as much as I do a hobby at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's so in lieu of that then. So what is your because I know you've got a lot of projects and things that you're working on. What's your main, well, let's go this way. If you were to start over as an entrepreneur today with the technology and everything that we have going on right now, what would you do to launch your business online?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. Okay, so I would look at what do I actually know how to do. This is something that, in a lot of ways, I didn't really have any skills. I developed my skills as I went along. Yeah. That was one thing that kind of just the way my journey worked. Is it was weird to go to work in corporate America for 10 years and realize I don't know how to do anything. And even getting out of business school. So during this whole time, I developed a lot of my skills. That being said, I think that one thing that you can do is as you're building your platform, there's a lot of, I have friends who have gone out and done a lot of things for free for people to build their portfolio of work. You have to have something of value to bring to people. That is, at the end of the day, that's really all it comes down to. Like, now I have a skill. Like, I know how to interview people. I can extract stories out of people. That is actually useful in other contexts. Like, I do this on a freelance basis for people as well. So the thing is that, if you don't have anything to bring to somebody, and I'll give you an example that isn't one of my own. Like, Ryan Holiday is pretty well known as sort of the book marketing strategist for pretty much every big name author. Like, anybody who, like Tim Ferriss, Robert Greene, and, couple of others have all leveraged Ryan as their go-to guy. But Robert and I talked about this. Why Ryan? Because Ryan had something that wasn't in Robert's DNA. Ryan understood the internet and the mechanics of how the internet works when Robert was working on the 48 Laws of Power. So there was something that he could bring to him, and he basically became his apprentice. And so in that process, he had something to offer, and he also developed his skills to the point where now, Ryan is a highly sought after book marketing strategist. So you kind of look at here's what I would say is, when you evaluate opportunities, don't look at – and this is something I did really wrong early on – is don't look at what they are worth in the moment. Look at what they might be worth a year from now. Like, I recently did the book marketing for something called the Fear Project. Didn't pay a fortune, but I realized – being the social media strategist for a book launch for a published author, that would actually be an incredibly valuable portfolio building skill. So that's what I usually think about these days. I mean, if I were to start over, Charlie Gilkey told me something the other day, which I thought was useful. He's like, write 50 blog posts before you do anything else. Because here's what it is. People get caught up in a bunch of useless crap. They worry about their metrics. They worry about, how many tweets did this get? I honestly think that I made a lot of those mistakes. I worried about things that didn't really matter, right?
Yep.
So And I also think that there's this whole idea of part of this is not to knock life coaches, but there's this great sketch on the Jon Stewart show. I think it was Dimitri Martin, where he talks about life. People who go to a life coach, usually what they end up becoming is a life coach, like what they learn from their life coaching. So it's this vicious cycle, and so and you kind of see that in the online world a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that really the key is go, where you can be hired as a freelancer and develop skills. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I love that too, because my path and journey was a lot like yours, where it was realizing, oh my gosh, I spent all this time doing all this stuff, and it really isn't anything that I learned. I mean, you learn a lot of skills, don't get me wrong, from what you go through, but I like where you're talking about focusing on what you're good at, because I see so many people getting started and they're trying to, they launch a product and then they see somebody else do it and they want to copy it, and they're trying to be in 50 different places and be the expert all across the board. And it's like, no, just hone in and then, work with other projects that you can learn and grow from. I think that's brilliant. I mean, and you pick up so much skill set from that no matter what. And I like looking towards the future, because I think a lot of us, we look so close that it doesn't really, you can't paint the picture going forward, but you can see what it is, your idea for it. So with that being said, I'm all over the place today. I've had too much coffee. What are your predictions for social media going forward and the trends that you see with online media and marketing for entrepreneurs?
Obviously, I think it's kind of amusing to me to see the podcasting renaissance. Everybody and their mother is starting a podcast. Now, here's what I do predict. I think a lot of what you saw in the blogosphere is going to happen to the podcast boomers too. It's going through a boom, but the same thing that happened is, it's not like you're going to start a podcast and overnight you're going to be this just massive success, right? Yep. And you're going to have sort of – it's kind of the 90-day rule of the blogosphere, right? Most blogs aren't around for more than 90 days. So what you'll have is all these people who start – and to me, I always am sort of skeptical of the people who invest thousands of dollars in podcasting equipment. It's like, wait a minute, you don't even have an audience. What are you doing that for? It's like, buy yourself a $50 microphone and record 20 episodes first.
Exactly.
But the thing is that – as excited as all these people are about podcasting, I think we're going to see sort of a drop off at some point where, like anything, right? The cream is going to rise to the top. Yep. You're kind of seeing the same thing. I think self-publishing is going to be a huge trend. because Guy Kawasaki and I had this conversation. For the longest time, there's been this sort of stigma of, okay, well, if you're a self-published author, you're not nearly as cool as a traditionally published author. But then he compared it to sort of artisan beer brewing, right? Like, you don't look at the artisan brewer and criticize him for the fact that he's not Budweiser. Budweiser tastes like crap anyways, right? It's like, oh, I don't have this huge beer factory, so my beer isn't as good. In fact, you're the local brewer making, brewery at the local restaurant makes much better beer, and he's really an artisan. And the thing is that what's happening now is all the sort of tools that are available to somebody. Every resource that a publishing company gives you is available to you, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm going to do a print version of this last book very soon. And one of my friends named Mars Dorian, who is another person you should interview, who's really hilarious and awesome. He's this really skilled artist. And he said, hey, Srini, he's like, I'd love to do a book cover for the print version. I said, yeah. So, all these resources that you traditionally get from the publisher are now available to you. The question is executing at that way. Yeah, maybe the book won't get in Barnes & Noble. But Seth Godin also told me something about sort of that whole thing. He said, he's like, the day and age in which strangers stumble upon your books, unless you're, a New York Times bestseller, nobody goes into a bookstore and says, you know what, I don't know this person. It happens, but not as much. Right. Really, the people who buy books are the people that are already reading your stuff. And Seth talks all about this. He writes books for the people who are already reading his blog. It's not, writing for strangers.
Right.
And so I think this sort of idea of interrupting strangers is going to come to an end. People are going to be much more sort of community centric. You're going to see much more of what Seth would call tribes. Yep. Like, AJ Leone is a great example of this. I don't know if you follow his work. He has a site called Pursuit of Everything. Mm-hmm. Literally, honestly, nobody knew who he was about 6 to 8 months ago. Now you can't look through your Facebook feed without somebody mentioning him at least once or twice a day.
Yeah.
And it's because he's cultivated – he basically looked at who was already paying attention, and he did everything for them. Everything is about the people that are already paying attention to him, not interrupting a bunch of people who are strangers. So that's a trend I think you're going to see.
Yeah. Well, I want to interject there really quick because the whole concept of the tribe, that's one of the biggest things why I focus on helping people get started with podcasting, and doing that is because that's how you can build that loyal listener and that tribe. Because just what you're talking about, we don't just write. The marketing place is so loud out there with all the books, all the content, especially with Kindle. Like Tim Ferriss's book, his last book did more sales with the digital version for the first time. It's crazy what's going on now with how you can self-publish. So what are your process and thoughts on how do you build that tribe and that following? Because that is a skill of being able to do that. And what do you think are the best outlets for people to be able to do that and connect with people?
Okay, so by outlets, do you mean certain like channels as far as
social media, Twitter, whatever you think that's worked the best with for the Blogcast or for anything that you've done?
Okay, so it really honestly depends. One, I think it depends on what you have fun with. That's key. Like if you're doing it with an end in mind, or if you're doing it because you're trying to get to some goal, and yes, it's important to have goals, but if you're not enjoying the process of doing it, like let's take Pinterest for example, right? Pinterest is all the rage. I don't have the patience for it. I find it boring. I can't get. And my business partner David thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I went on it for a while. I played with it for like a week, and I was like, okay, this is just boring. I'm like, it's a bunch of pictures and quotes, and I'm not interested in. I just couldn't get on board with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, that being said, I think that really it's not necessarily about the platform. It's what you do on that platform. And so for me, it's been Twitter and Facebook and then Google+. And then, of course, email is another one. But it's funny, I think really the Small Army strategy is about building a tribe. And what I do is not necessarily look at the platforms. Let's forget about platform altogether.
Perfect.
Because that's I'm not going to tell you anything that anybody doesn't already know. There's one thing that underlies all of these platforms. You know what it is? People. So to me, that's what you have to focus on is who is actually behind it, because it's not just an avatar, it's not just a profile picture, it's a real person. And when you focus on that, that's how things get built. to me, that's always been the thing that, I mean, I think that's the thing that people really see about my brand is that I understand that. I mean, and part of it is that's just the way I'm naturally built. One of my friends said something really brilliant. His name is Colin Wright. It's a site called Exile Lifestyle. So too many people are building an audience of numbers instead of an audience of people.
Yeah. That's
so
brilliant.
The platforms are irrelevant. So yeah, I don't necessarily think it's about platform. I think it's about the platform is really a facilitator. It's a connection tool. And what it connects you to is other people.
Yeah. Okay. So when you're talking about with the listeners of building it for them, I think that's so crucial that so many people have missed in the marketplace, especially now with the publishing world of writing books, because, and I think Tim Ferriss talks about this, a lot of other experts talk about this, is people forgot who's on the end of the, who's buying the books or whatever it is for your products and services. So with you building your tribe, you were talking about people, and it's people at the end of the day. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think I've done is made myself ridiculously accessible, almost to a fault. And the thing is, sometimes I think people perceive our audiences to be way bigger than they are, right? And Kris Gilbertson really kind of taught me something valuable. He said, so you have 15 people who are paying attention. Treat those people like the most important people in the world, because I track down people who I know are supporting my work. And I've been trying to figure out why my last book has been selling well, because I really want to find out who linked it. I don't think it's doing this on its own. I think somebody mentioned it somewhere on a big blog. And I've been dying to figure out who it is, because I owe them a huge debt of gratitude for doing that. So I make it a point to really, I have one-on-one conversations with a lot of listeners. And, they're not conversations in which I have them to gain anything. I just say hello to people. It's like, hey, I've never chatted with you before.
Yeah.
Let's chat. And this is just part of my DNA. I mean, it's just the way I'm built. I like connecting with people. I really do genuinely enjoy talking to people. And so that's why it works for me. It's funny because, my friend asked me the other day, he said, he noted that one of the things I did was I just started chatting with him on GChat out of the blue. Yeah. And he said, do you basically do this intentionally? I was like, I wish I could tell you that I sit down every day and say, today I'm going to make a list. I'm going to chat with 3 people. I said, no, this is just how I am. If I see that we have had a lot of interactions on Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, and I notice that you're in my GChat, I'll just say hi. And from there, a lot of things happen. So, and the funny thing, so here's one of the things that a lot of people will probably come back with when I say this, is that approach doesn't scale. Well, here's my response. It doesn't have to. And the thing is, are you really at the point yet where that approach needs to scale? Most people are not. I'm not. Yeah. I mean, Kris Gilbertson told me he sent the first 10,000 subscribers to the Art of Nonconformity a personal letter, just saying, hey, thanks for signing up. I hope you're enjoying the blog. And I was like, that is the simplest but one of the most effective things I've ever done.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the techniques I talk about in my book. And I credit him for it. I honestly, I was blown away by that. But I think that when you start to view everybody that you interact with as a full human being, you start to really kind of you paint this picture of them. To me, it's like, okay, you're not just an avatar on Twitter. You're not just a username on Twitter. What else is there? One of my natural habits, the minute somebody mentions me on Twitter, is I go and look at what they're all about. I look at their website. I go and check them out on Facebook. It's at this point, I don't even think about it. It's just what I do.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think you really have an opportunity. Yeah, and I wish I had been like this earlier about doing this, but if you have an audience of 100 people, my God, I mean, think about the rabid following you can create if you're willing to invest in treating them like people. I mean, take every one of your email subscribers that actually communicates with you and chat with them on Skype. You got 100 fans on Facebook and you talk to them daily. Have a Skype chat with them. You'd be amazed what you learn just from a few conversations.
Yes, that's what it's about. I mean, Kyle Garrett, I love him. He's a big videographer, and I had him on my show, and he's like, when you're getting started, how did he say this? Now I just forgot. Support the few, and the many will come. Because serve the few, and the many will come and follow. And it's with you have a huge audience. You really do. I mean, I know you say that it's not huge, but it really is a big audience. But it's so such a tight tribe too. I mean, people, 95% of them listen to the interviews that you do. I mean, that is phenomenal. And you have high interaction. That is amazing. And it comes with that personal connection. And I think that's, for me, what I see is that's the missing piece for a lot of people. And what's going to be going forward is you have to have that connection nowadays, because the days of the shiny, just crazy marketing are way over. So thank you for sharing that. That's just brilliant. So I want to, I could talk to you for another 4 hours right now with so many different ideas. But what I'd love to do is I want you to just, let's kind of wrap up a little bit here into some stuff and tell me about your life, your lifestyle. You're a surfer. I love that. I snowboard. I haven't really gotten into the water side. I've always lived in, I've been landlocked my entire life. I'm here in Denver. But, so tell us about that and what you've learned from that and just more about your lifestyle.
Sure. Well, it's funny. It's funny you snowboard. I started snowboarding this last year mainly because I needed something to do when the waves were bad, and we have a lot of mountains here in California. But surfing was one of those things that really, it was weird because I've never been athletic. I mean, I was the worst athlete on every sports team I ever played on when I was a kid, and to take up something as athletic as surfing, I think really kind of shocked a lot of people in my life. But for me, lifestyle was the other thing that's funny is I think people have this idea that I don't sleep, which is really amusing to me. I see it on Facebook all the time. I'm like, wow, if you only hung out with me for a day, you'd be so disappointed to see how lazy I might appear. I'm efficient because I'm forced to be. As I mentioned, my attention span is way too short not to be efficient. That's why I don't, I hated being in an office more than anything in the world. That's what I hated about almost every corporate job. It's I have to be here from 8 to 5. Why? Yep. This makes no sense to me at all. Yeah. But lifestyle was, most of my recreational time these days is definitely spent in the water when the waves are good. I mean, it's one of those things. One of my lifelong dreams is to spend an entire year traveling the world and surfing all these different coastlines. I mean, I caught my first wave in Brazil, and it was like a religious experience. I remember I got out of the water and I was like, oh my God. I felt sort of this lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. It's something that I don't talk about very much anymore is I got diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome when I was younger, and it could be really bad at times. I mean, it's still surfing out to be the cure for it. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. My stomach hasn't felt like this in years. Wow. And, I just noticed that the more I did it, the more I did it, the more addicted I became to it. But it made me this really just anytime you get out of the water, you're in a different mood, you're happy, you're light. And it started to become this driving force. And I realized some of my best ideas come from being in the water. And we're so connected these days. We don't take time to disconnect. I think that it's something that I had to learn the hard way. I wish I'd, been like this when I was younger, but, it's brought a sense of peace to my life. I mean, that's really the thing that it's done. I mean, it's funny. And I've shared this before. I mean, some people know. I mean, I've lived at home for a while, mainly because I've worked really, to build this to what I want it to be, and that meant making certain sacrifices. It was like, okay, fortunately, I can do some of those things. I'm single and I don't have any other real responsibilities. So it's like, well, why put myself in a situation that's going to be ridiculously difficult when I don't need to? Yep. So, and then of course, I'm very big into travel, but these days, most of my travel plans are driven by waves as well, which is convenient since half the world is covered in water.
Oh, that's awesome. So I love with the disconnection too, because that is a big problem. I mean, you don't see people connected anymore. They're talking to each other on their phones and doing that. So what got you into surfing? How did you get started with that?
I was I did a study abroad in Brazil while I was in business school, and most of my friends who were supposed to stay until New Year's ended up leaving because they all ran out of money. I mean, we were traveling so much, and Brazil was so expensive. It's getting more expensive, but they all ended up going home early. So I was there with another friend who I didn't really have a lot in common with, but he liked to surf, and I was kind of getting bored of sitting on the beach and drinking. And so finally I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to just get in the water with this guy. And the strange thing is it wasn't the first time I tried it, but I could never stand up. I just kept falling off the board.
I know.
You snowboard, so you get it. It's not easy. These are things that have steep learning curves, and most people don't get past them. But once you get past the curve, you're like, oh my God, you've discovered the greatest thing since sliced bread. Yeah. So I was on this beach in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, in this tiny little town where we were spending New Year's, And it was 2 days before I left, which pisses me off to this day because, I was there for 6 months and I hardly ever surfed. And I stood up, and it was in that moment I was so hooked. But what really caused it to turn into this huge lifestyle was, one, I went to business school at Pepperdine, which is in Malibu. I was in Brazil thinking, wait a minute, I've been going to business school in front of the ocean for the last year. I've never thought to try surfing. What the hell is wrong with me? It took living in another country to realize what's right in front of me is something that I appreciate. Granted, the water is freezing here and you have to wear wetsuits, which sucks. But then, I graduated from business school and I was unemployed for almost 8 months. So I needed a way to keep myself from going nuts. So that's when I started my blog. But the other thing I started was surfing. So I surfed 6 hours a day for 8 months straight.
Wow.
And from that point forward, it was just like a drug. I mean, fortunately, the first real job I had allowed me to surf almost every day because I only had to be in the office 3 days a week. And that turned out to be the best winter California had in 10 years because of an El Nino year. So we got a lot of storms that year. And then I lived in Costa Rica for 6 months where I was doing 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the evening. And it's honestly, I can't fathom my life without it. My life seems like I can't even recognize my life before it. It's hard to see that. It's like, wow, what did part of me wonders, like, what was my time consumed with before all this? Like, how could it have, what would I do? It couldn't have been that interesting.
Yeah, that's so interesting when we have those epiphanies and things that we get into. That's so awesome. So where are the best places that you've caught the best waves? Like, tell us about that. I don't even know anything of really the surfy nature at all. So I'm always curious about this.
Well, Costa Rica definitely is world class. There's no question in my mind that I realized why it's considered a world class surf spot after spending 6 months there and coming back to California. I mean, don't get me wrong, California's definitely got its fair share of waves. I mean, most of my days when I'm not in front of the computer are spent in San Clemente, which is South Orange County.
I've heard about Mm-hmm.
And so it really. The other thing is it's this just beautiful medium, right? Like every time you're in it, you're like, wow, this is unreal. It never gets old. It's different every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's super addictive for that reason because there's the novelty never wears off. Like every single wave is different. Every single session is different. But I mean, some of the most amazing days of my life have been spent out in Costa Rica, and you're just like, wow, this is unreal. I mean, you're literally riding a wave and the sun's going down over the ocean, and it's this really bizarre feeling. You're kind of like, wow. That's why people say it's like a religious experience.
Yeah. Oh, I need to get out to California and start surfing because I love snowboarding. It's kind of the same for me with snowboarding. It's that release. It's that you just get out and you're in nature and it's just amazing. But there's something with liquid water that's just really cool. So, well, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for, this amazing content. I want to do this again because there's so much more I want to go into. But I want you to share with everybody where they can go find out more about you and any new projects or anything that you're working on right now.
Yeah, so you can find us on iTunes if you do a search for Blogcast FM. There's probably about 60 or 70 interviews. I don't remember how many. I think iTunes you have 50 or so of your latest interviews, and there you'll find our interviews with Seth Godin, Chris Brogan, Guy Kawasaki, Tim Ferriss, Danielle Laporte, pretty much anybody who's who we consider a celebrity online. And then if you go to Amazon, my latest book, The Small Army Strategy, is just 99 cents. So those are the two places you can find me. And of course, we have a newsletter for Blogcast FM, so that's another way people can connect with me.
Awesome. And I'm going to have this on my blog with all the details and all the places that you can connect with Srini as well. So again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had an absolute blast and I'll let you get back to your day. And thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And I hope you enjoyed that episode. I'd love to get your feedback here for the Lifestylepreneur podcast right in iTunes. Simply leave us a 5-star and a review letting us know what you like, who you're interested in hearing more from, and what topics you really want help with in your business that I can bring on those key experts to really fine tune and help you in your business and creating the lifestyle of your dreams. And I'll be giving shout outs, so make sure you put your name and your website address if you want me to share that with the community as well. And again, thanks for listening. I'm so excited that you found the Lifestylepreneur podcast, and I can't wait to connect with you and learn more about your business as we continue to grow this community. So again, have a great day, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Lifestylepreneur Podcast. Again, I'm Kris Gilbertson, and I'm committed to bringing you top training from leading lifestylepreneurs all over the world to help you break through and turn your dreams into your ideal lifestyle. And make sure to join us at www.lifestyleacademy.com to receive VIP training from specific guests I interview on the show so that you can really easily start to implement what you've learned from listening. I know we're all busy and sometimes we don't have time to listen to the entire podcast or take notes because I'm always listening on the go. So I like to call it the Lifestyle Cliff Notes to creating your ideal business and make it really simple for you. So those will be sent via the email list. Plus, I also want to connect with you personally, and being on the Lifestyle Academy mailing list is where all the magic happens. We'll host VIP trainings once a month that we can't always bring out on the podcast with even more detailed information. And I also want to connect with you personally. I want to know what's going on in your business and what you need help with and who I can bring on to aid you in creating your ideal lifestyle. And so I'll be asking questions every once in a while that I want you to reply, and I reply back to you personally. So again, until next time, wishing you on your way to achieving all of your dreams. Talk to you soon.